Hello and welcome to the Kenyan Review interview series. My name is Misha Rai. I'm the contributing editor at Kenyan Review. And with me is the writer A.A. Balaskovits. Hi, Alison. Welcome to the Kenyan Review interview series. And thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview.
No, thank you so much, Misha. And thanks to Kenyan. I'm really excited.
Yay. So first, I just want to say congratulations on your sophomore collection of short stories, Strange Folk You'll Never Meet, which is out on October 1st. Am I right?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
That's great. And I also wanted to say that it's such a beautiful collection of short stories. And am I right that it's published by the same people who published your first collection, Santa Fe Writers Project?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And the first collection won a grand prize. Am I right about that?
Yeah,
too?
the Santa Fe Writers Project Literary Awards.
Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
So wonderful. I remember being at AWP when the collection sold out, like several times. And I just think, I just remember thinking how marvelous it must be to have something like that happen.
It really is. It really is honestly kind of astounding each time in a really good way. I think the covers do a lot of work because both of the books have really gorgeous covers.
Yeah, and since we're on covers, I'm going to lift this up. It's so beautiful. This is such a stunning cover. I always think that the business of making books, of putting books together is so much more goes into it than just the, the writing, the editing, and, obviously the publishing. And I suppose one of the things that's very in our face and obvious is the cover. Like so many people pick up a book because of the cover, because something about the cover catches their attention. And I guess this makes me curious. I'm naturally curious, but I'm curious about covers specifically. Talk to me about this cover and what went into having this cover.
Yeah, and you actually bring up a good point. Like when I started out sort of writing, I definitely felt that it was very much a solitary activity, but it's not. It is not, unless you're sort of journaling, I suppose. But that cover, the design was done by Gwen Graft. So the lettering and the formatting and everything, and she did the design for the inside of the book as well. But the art comes from Virginia Frances Starrett, and I'm probably butchering her last name. But she was an artist who from like around 1900, and she was born in Chicago. Which is where I'm, the same area as where I'm from. And she does this sort of like beautiful fairy tale work. And she did die fairly early, I think in her 30s, I want to say. So it was really, when we found that image and, I was looking up the history of it, it was really important for me to be able to sort of like reshare her work, even in this sort of small way, because she's fantastic.
I love that. I love the idea of like honoring someone else's art as we honor our own art.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a beautiful story. And are you like proper Chicago area, or is it sort of like Chicagoland? I feel like I've heard Chicagoland or something.
Yeah, and that is sort of the thing. I notice when I speak to people who are not from Chicago, I will say that I'm from Chicago because it's easier. But Chicagoans would definitely call me on the lie because it is the Chicagoland area, the suburbs.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I'm beginning to realize that what we imagine as our space in the world is not always the way other people see that space.
Right.
And when we claim that we're from a particular place, somebody else might have a different idea of it. I always think like maps are fictions, that depending on which side of the border you're standing on, you sort of like make that up as you go along. So I guess one of my questions that I have for this particular interview has to do with this theme of nourishment that I find in your short stories. Like there's so much emphasis on nourishment, on gnawing and going hungry and being emaciated. Would you unpack that idea for me, that idea of nourishment?
Yeah. I mean, for me, I do use that sort of either like starving or hungry. And for me, it's definitely just sort of a like metaphor placeholder for desire, for want, for longing. It always is, I mean, anytime you kind of start to write about fiction, you learn about that your characters need to want something, right?
Mhm.
And I think it's really important for writers to be aware of sort of like what's happening within their own communities, but also sort of the larger political situation. And especially right now, there is, I think, sort of a collective psychic desire, a wanting, because we're starting to more obviously realize like how much we're missing out on something or how much something is broken or lost.
That's amazing. That's such a prescient answer for what I was looking at, what I was looking for, especially since I also wonder like the role of sort of nourishment in fairy tales. Like,
Mm,
do you think there's a niche in that mirrors what's happening in the world right now?
mm-hmm. And there is, and in sort of what we would call the classic fairy tales, like Grimm's, Anderson, and I'm gonna say
Mhm.
his name wrong because oof, I'm so bad at foreign languages. Perrault, but it's
Perrault.
French,
Let's
so you
just
probably don't
say
you probably don't say the T at the end.
just
Um,
let's say Perrault.
Perrault. Sorry, fairy tale scholars. But fruit or nourishment are always sort of a double-edged sword in those. You think of what Snow White eating the apple and it's
Mm.
poisonous. There's also this very fun fairy tale. It's a little bit obscure about this pot that you can ask it to sort of essentially like feed you, and it does just sort of magically. And then someone keeps asking the pot to do it, and then it just overflows and fills the whole town with food. So food is always very strange in fairy tales because occasionally it contains your family members too. There's a lot of cannibalism.
This just reminds me of Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus, which is
Mm,
one of my favorite plays, and I of Shakespeare, and I watched it on the Globe in London. I
mhm.
went every single day for a month, and I watched people just
I am so
scream.
jealous.
But I watched people just sort of like faint and scream each time the meat pies come out, each
Mhm.
time the rape scene happens, and etc. So like that, there's that connectivity. I feel like in all of
Mhm.
literature when it comes to food.
Oh, yeah, and what is it? The juniper tree also
Mm.
has, the mother, what is it, cooking, I think, the son into a
Hmm.
pie and then giving it to her husband and like blaming the death on her daughter. Oh no, it's the stepmother. It's always the
Mm.
stepmother in these things.
Why is that?
I think I did. I wish I could say who I read this from, but my memory of names is very terrible. But there was a suggestion that, stepmothers had a more precarious place in the
Mm.
family, right? So they wouldn't necessarily inherit because the oldest son essentially would. And so they would rely on the son then to take care of them after the patriarch dies.
Mm.
And because there's not like that blood connection between the stepmother and the son, there's some suggestions that that would have created some tension in the family. And that's why stepmothers kind of get a real bad rap in these tales.
Yeah, I mean, I love that you started with by saying that there is a suggestion that
Hmm.
their roles are in families are precarious,
Hmm.
and by doing that, you've already placed this woman outside,
Right.
and the universal you has placed her outside, which makes it easier also to villainize her and to not
Hmm.
fully understand her perspective. Um,
Which is
I,
also interesting because my reading of that would be that the stepmother is acting out of, anxiety that she feels for her place within the social system as the social system is constructed.
yeah.
So really that should lead us to sort of view her more sympathetically, or we would now in more like contemporary times. But the way that they're often presented in those old stories, not so much.
No, not so much. And I love that we're talking about contemporary times and that there's a push for the gray. There's a push for
Hmm.
the anti-hero. There's a push to understand why we've created villains and why are these villains villains. I
Hmm.
love that. I absolutely love that.
Oh yeah.
And this sort of like I'm taking a hard left here, but it sort of brings me to um, perhaps it's not a hard left to the review that you got from Publishers Weekly. And I think this is why that beautiful review exists, is because you're able to see the grays, because you're able to champion the anti-heroes and the villains and try to understand them. And I'm just going to like ask you to indulge me while I read out the review for you and for all the folks at home. This is what the review says. Balaskovits' prose never fails to impress, capturing the cadence of fairy tales while bringing a literary sense of detail and subtext to clearly loved genre tropes. This accomplished collection interlocks the horrific and the wondrous through deliciously dry humor, resulting in a unique must-read for fans of Angela Carter, Maria Davna Headley, and A.S. Byatt. And now, if I can just say this, like let me say those names out loud again. So it's Angela Carter, Maria Davna Headley, and A.S. Byatt. Those are some heavyweight names.
Yes,
those are some serious names.
I am humbled by the comparison.
And this is what I was going to say. You've sort of, I feel like you've been anointed. You've sort of been anointed in such company, with such company, in such company. And what does that do to you as a writer and as a person? Like to have your work compared to these heavyweights?
I think I sort of consider myself a very like bargain basement Angela Carter, so that makes sense to me. Well, I'm very inspired by her. I read her in undergrad at first, and that she set me off on this journey, so this is all her fault. The other two, though, I was surprised. So that I honestly don't know what it feels like. I think I just sort of thought, oh, and then tried to not think about it.
I think maybe that's a sane way to do it, like just to forget about it. Like it's great to be compared to Byatt. And again, I'm butchering her last name, but I absolutely adore her fiction. I absolutely love it. And I can see the comparisons between her work and your work. When I teach Byatt, I often teach stories that are set in the woods. People are getting lost, things are happening to them. There is an interesting cruelty to her work that I find in your work too, like an offhand sort of, when I say cruelty, I mean this offhandedness, a matter of factness. And I have to say this, that I literally just taught a story by Maria Davna Headley. And one of my students, who's like this little chicken of a boy, had this sort of waited until the end of the class to have a feeling. And he was sort of like, he said, she doesn't let up. Like she just doesn't let up. And I was like, oh, I know.
Please send me that story.
I will. I'll send you the story. It's this beautiful story. But it was a joy. For me, when I read that review for you, I just thought this makes complete sense, because there are stories of yours that don't let up, like that just sort of march to the drum of their own beat, a beat that in a very prescient way shows us what the world we live in is like, especially when we want to look away. And so the fairy tales sort of trick us into that world, if that makes sense.
That does make sense, yeah. I very much confess I haven't read much of the other two authors, and that might be why I'm ignoring it.
No.
I've only read The Virgin in the Garden from Byatt, and that was so many years ago.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I've read several of her works, and definitely am a big fan. And I wish I'd read more of Headley, but Angela Carter is gorgeous, just absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, she is. She definitely takes a more positive approach to the stories than I do, and I greatly admire that she was able to do that.
It is interesting that you say that, because I feel like your narrators, like your stories, the protagonists in those stories have a great deal of agency. That they're doing these sort of interesting things, that they're making choices in a way that, maybe I haven't seen in other fairy tales or like in other kinds of fiction. And I think to me, that feels like a positive thing.
And I see that. I wonder though, I'm curious about this, whether we consider agency sort of the end all be all. And Angela Carter has this great line from, I'm going to say this wrong too, I think it's the Sadian women. And it's that a free woman in an unfree society will be a monster. So she can have all the agency in the world, but if, society sort of, like grinds her down, to steal from Margaret Atwood, I don't know, you're still potentially still the villain, and you're still going to feel the pain of being in that society, no matter how much agency you think you have.
I think that is so fascinating, this idea of the monstrous woman,
Mm-hmm.
especially the idea of the woman who knows what she wants, is confident in her wants, has a clear idea of where she's going and how she's going to get there, and in some ways has to break the rules to get there, that she
Mm-hmm.
does automatically become monstrous.
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing a lot more of that in television and in books, in the way that women become monstrous because society doesn't make space for them.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually harkens back to the idea of agency and this beautiful story that you have, which, by the way, is also like really traumatizing
Oh,
to
sorry.
me. Yeah, I mean, but you live for that. You want to traumatize us. And this is the
Yeah.
story about, and I'm so sorry, I wish I had this like pulled up right in front of me, but your beautiful book. This is the story about the husband and wife, in which the wife sort of ends up taking things into her. Okay, this is the story. It's The Skin of Strange Animals.
Mm-hmm.
It's the story with the donkey in it.
Yes. A
And
very loose retelling of Donkey Skin.
right, but that ending is like the choice that she makes. I don't want to give it away to anybody who's watching us, watching this interview. I don't want to give the ending away to them, but she makes a very particular choice. And I am curious about what led you to make that choice in the story for her.
Mm-hmm.
Because she's doing the thing that a lot of people do, which is like, when you're faced with a crisis, instead of like trying to unpack the crisis immediately, she looks away, she tries to find an excuse.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many ways that that
Mm-hmm.
she's coming to terms with what's going on. So please talk
Yeah.
to me a little bit about the choice that you made.
Right. For a little context, so the story is about a woman who is not super into, the milestones of life, getting married, having children, but she does end up marrying this guy, and she does have a child with him. And their relationship starts to deteriorate, but not in any like grand way, just sort of the small ways that relationships do over time sometimes. But she starts to notice that her husband perhaps has predilections for younger children. And so I was, I think I was really thinking about the story of Sandusky, that guy.
Mm,
And I was
mm,
thinking about his wife, because in
mm.
interviews, she said that she didn't know. And the sort of media suggestion was that how could you not know? But there's plenty of ways that you could not know, that you can suspect, but you don't ask, or you don't look to see what the truth of the matter is.
Yeah.
And so my character does not a really super a grand thing. I would say a very passive aggressive act at the end. And it's just sort of the small ways that you sort of fight back, I suppose.
Mm. I love that, the small ways that you fight back, and her way of fighting back is like really terrorizing him in this strange sort of minor way that would
Hmm.
seem minor to us, but anyone who has a major phobia is like really
Right.
going to
Yeah,
be
she
worried
really
about
leans
it.
into his phobia.
Yeah. And since this is a retelling, it brings me to the next thing that I was thinking about. Your short story collection is interesting in two ways to me. One is that it is made up of retellings and
Hmm.
original fairy tales. And then also it's put together in a way where you have a lot of shorts and these very long stories.
Yes.
And so I guess I have a question that's twofold. One is, why do retellings of fairy tales do so well? Why are we obsessed with retellings? That's
Hmm.
one. And my second question is, tell me a little about where your originals come from, these
Okay.
original stories that you've written. Yeah.
I think fairy tales, they never really fall out of fashion, right?
Mm.
And I would say that this is, any culture that has fairy tales, like they keep coming back up, right? Even in, especially like in America, I noticed that, in commercials they're used a lot. I think very famously, oh gosh, what was it? Whoopi Goldberg was selling, what was it? They were like, they were panties for at night, right? In case you're
Mm.
leaking. And they did it as a play off of The Princess and the Pea.
Wow.
And yeah, and it was fun, right? But then you have all the sexification of Red Riding Hood, sort of an adult, now going after the wolf, who's, usually an attractive man. And they keep getting used, I think, because they're simple stories that often we hear as children. And because they're so flat, and actually Kate Bernheimer has an excellent essay sort of talking about the craft of fairy tales. And those flat characters, which she talks about, I think really stick in our minds because Red Riding Hood could look like any girl, right? It doesn't really matter who she is. We just know that she has a red cloak and that she's going to encounter a wolf. And with that, there's so much to play around in, right?
Yeah, you can project so many things onto that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It is essentially just, a tabula rasa that you can put any of your ideas or any of your politics into, right? And fairy tales are often used politically. There was what is it, in the Third Reich, there was this movie which I've only been able to find stills of, but it was also a retelling of Red Riding Hood, where of course she was a very young, like, Aryan girl. The woodsman was an SS soldier, and the wolf was essentially a Jewish caricature stereotype.
Wow.
Right.
Wow.
And so, I mean, it's very like on the nose in that case, but we can, they're such simple stories that we can imbue whatever we want on them, which makes them sort of dangerous too, in a way.
Oh, absolutely. I can see that. I can see how they can be dangerous and how you can use these stories any way that you want.
And I forgot the second part of your question.
I'm sorry. No, the second question, before we get to the second part, I have to stop for a minute. I want to see that Whoopi Goldberg commercial now. I'm going to,
you.
I feel like send it to me. Otherwise, I'm going to go down the YouTube rabbit hole is what's going to happen. Now, the second part of my question was like, I wanted to ask you, where do the originals come from? The original fairy tales? What does it take to like make an original fairy tale? I guess what's the process here is what I'm curious about.
There is, I mean, I guess you could really like kind of go by the numbers and use like a very flat character, abstraction. I'm trying to think of what Kate Bernheimer says in that essay. There's like there's a logic to it. That's like, if you come across a talking cat, no one's like, I'm going to spend 5 pages thinking about why the cat is talking.
Right.
It just is. You just sort of accept it, right? And so you can kind of do it that way. But fairy tales, I think, have a certain, they do all those things, but there's a certain quality to them. Like, and I don't want to like make the comparison to how people talk about porn, but it's like, if you see it, you know it, right? You know when something is a fairy tale. And I think because they're all kind of not necessarily similar to each other, but they have similar sort of tropes, and they have sort of similar conventions, and in a way sort of similar tales. Like, they're often going to end somewhat happily-ish. And if, the evil will be punished, good will be rewarded, it'll end in a marriage. So yeah, I think my original ones, what I'm trying to do is make more of a contemporary version of that. I think 2 or 3 of the ones I have in there are about adoption. And it's just because for me, putting adoption into a fairy tale, I thought would be interesting because so much of, fairy tales are about like the blood and how blood connects people and your family, and sort of relates back to our conversation about stepmothers. But also I'm adopted, so there you go.
And I guess there's the idea of like the families we choose, right?
The families, absolutely. I am 100% about that.
The families we choose as opposed to the families we get plopped down on because of biology. That's so fascinating to me, this idea of like constructing a fairy tale somehow more than fiction, just like a fictional story which could be realist or whatever else. Like fairy tales seem like they're the kind of things that have been passed down from generations. So the idea of making something new, something that can then become part of this tradition of being passed down is potent in this sort of wonderful way. Okay, so I want you to talk to me about this story of yours, which is like, and I'm going to butcher the name here, but is it Aegas Leporidae? Like, what is that? Like, what is that?
So you know that unfortunate thing when you're writing and you don't really say these words out loud and you just sort of write them down and you have no idea how to pronounce
You made
them?
this up. Is this what happened?
This is 100% what happened. I have no idea how to pronounce the title.
Okay, let's make a pronunciation up right now. So what's the pronunciation?
In my head, I was saying "e gest Laporte," but I think "e guest" sounds better.
So are we saying Eguest Laporte then? That's what we've decided on.
Let's roll with that. Yeah,
let's
that
roll with
good.
Eguest Laporte. I have to say this sounds very posh, by the way. It's very posh sounding.
Yes, my ability to Google fancy words is pretty impressive.
It is. It absolutely is. So Eguest Laporte, for anyone out there, for all the people out there who are going to buy this book, because I'm sure you will, it's a gorgeous, beautiful book. The short story is called Eguest Laporte. Now, this story sort of haunted me, I have to be honest, as it would haunt any woman thinking about having a child, any woman who's like paying attention to her reproduction cycle right now, or her reproductive years, is like thinking about that. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, because I feel like this is what I've come across in the story is not far off from the world that I've encountered, or lots of women encounter, the medical world that we encounter. So tell me about the story, the origin of the story, what's interesting about the story that made you want to write it.
Oh, okay. So this was inspired by Mary Toft. So she was, I can't remember what time period she lived in, but it was before a lot of technology happened. And she convinced a lot of people that she was giving birth to animal parts, essentially. She actually fooled like the medical people at the time. They were like, we're not actually sure whether she is or not. And I think, what is it she said, that I believe the first time it happened, she said that she had spied like a cat or a rabbit, and then she had given birth immediately to these sort of like bloody parts. Yeah, she's like super cool.
Yeah.
So the story was inspired by that, but I also, then made it terrible. So
no, but this is the other part. Like, you made it terrible, but for me, the ending signifies something else. But let me just read out something to you, your own work to you, because that's the other thing, that this Wonderful. Is the joy. This is the joy of doing these interviews, actually, is to talk to authors and be able to read out their work to them and tell them how much it means to me. So apart from this being a beautiful and heartbreaking short story collection, it's just wonderfully constructed. The sentences are beautiful, like and brutal. Like, for example, you've got this line: her husband only sighed and did the duty of his labor. He buried the meat in the yard under the oak, then took her to bed again. And if I was to teach the story, which I hope I'll get to teach, one of the things that I would ask my students to pay attention is to how time is constructed, and how quickly or how smartly time is constructed here. So you've got, he buried the meat in the yard under the yoke, then took her to bed again. So there's the cruelty, there's this that you made it terrible, there's the cruelty of that. But then the second thing is, we don't know when he takes her to bed, then the next day, 5 days from now. And this is also habitual action. And one knows, presumably, if you've been paying attention to biology and female's body and science, is that once you've had a miscarriage, you have to wait a bit before you can like try for a child again. You just have to wait a bit for the womb and for the body to heal. And there's just this terribleness at play here.
Yeah. And that I think that sort of like masculinity, for lack of a better term, toxic masculinity, I suppose. It's so frustratingly common sometimes. I think often of Andrea Yates's husband and her. She was, for context, she was a woman who did murder her children, but she had attempted it several times, and doctors were telling the husband, like, don't leave her alone with the children, and also maybe stop impregnating her because she's really suffering from postpartum depression, right? And so he, afterwards she was jailed and everything, and they sort of interviewed him, asking him, are you two going to stay together?
Yeah.
And he said, yeah. And once she's out, we're going to start trying again. And the casual cruelty of that is astounding. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's what I'm saying when I talk about the prescientness of your prose and the stories that you're telling, is that there is a mirroring effect of the world that we live in. And at the same time, um, there are those aspects of fairy tales that allow us to read the story and be like, these are fairy tales, like you can sort of trick yourself into believing that this is a tale.
Right. But
Not even,
fairy tales are always talking about, giving advice for how to perhaps survive in the world,
Mhm.
but also telling you what the world looks like,
Yeah.
or in a very positive way, what it could look like if justice was actually served.
Yeah, I always think, like, I'm always saying this, that fiction, I think the job of good fiction is to show what the world is and what the world can be.
Yeah.
And when I say that, I don't mean like to preach that the world has to be a better place, but I think it must give you hope. It must give you a flash of kindness, a flash of goodness, a flash of
Mhm.
something that allows us to realize that even if the end of that story is brutal and hard, even if the end of the story is hundreds of soldiers, and this is, I'm thinking about, for some reason, the Swedish Russian war, and I'm not sure why
Mhm.
this popped in my head, that so many soldiers died. Gosh, this is a bad analogy, so I'm going to backtrack from here. But
Okay.
all I'm trying to say is that it gives us something, it gives the reader something. And I
Mhm.
feel that this story, the ending, does this. And I'm going to read the section out where it says, when the mother was naked and sobbing, they backed away from her. The mother-in-law stepped forward and dared put her hands in the space between her legs to feel the soft gray fur covering her from thigh to belly. So not only has the wife in the story become mother, she's nothing else, she has been labeled the mother, but she has also been brutalized. And after the brutalization has taken place, her mother-in-law, who has so far been has been sort of like this minor character who we can't tell whether she's her ally or not, steps up
Mhm. Yeah.
and does a kindness. And I often think that women helping other women out, it can be a radical act because we are not given the space to be kind to each other. Because
Mhm.
sometimes you're in a room alone with a woman and you don't know if you should band together or you should pretend that the other person doesn't exist because of the way that the world has been constructed around us.
Mhm.
So this small act, I think, despite the fact that you said you made it bleak and dark, at the end here, in that room with all these powerful men, one woman reaches out to another woman.
Mhm.
And that is, I think, a radical act and beautiful. And in that way, harkens to Angela Carter's more positive storytelling.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think, I mean, that is sort of my point of view, I suppose, about radicalness as it is allowed, right? Obviously, the radicalness that is not allowed is perhaps more effective, but in these, you know, the small things that we can do for each other in those sort of delicate moments, like really, really matter. Um, and I think I was thinking there, the mother-in-law, like she too has obviously had a child.
Mhm.
And so she's experienced that. And I wonder, when you are looking at someone else's body being, like desecrated, being reduced to one particular thing, how can you not feel that in your own? Like,
Mm.
even if the body doesn't necessarily look at you, like we are
Mm.
all, yeah, I suppose that.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I just there are so many of the stories here where there is a moment where people reach out to each other, and it's often women reaching out to each other in these quiet, soft sort of ways, in whatever small ways that they can,
Mm-hmm.
and then also learning how to survive in those sort of ways, and
Yeah,
I think that's
that actually, so that makes me think of two things. One is that I don't know if actually like men do this in their bathrooms,
mm,
but in public bathrooms for women, you will often find like various things sort of graffitied on the
mm,
walls. And
mm,
sometimes it is warnings
mm.
against men.
Yeah.
Um, or other people, or sometimes it's someone asking for kindness on a bathroom stall with a
Mm,
pen, and other
mm,
people will write hopeful messages to them.
mm,
And that is, I always like what that has a fancy name, Laternalia or something. And I always am excited to see that, but I'm also sort of saddened that we have to be sort of reduced to these private spaces to be able to have certain conversations. And of course, that also reminds me of the time that you were that in my life. The audience may not know, but we've been friends for a absurdly long time.
11 years is not
11.
absurd. 11 years is nothing.
I
And
guess.
a lot. It's nothing and a lot in a lifetime of hopefully 40 years or something.
No, and so I know this, you know, this does make people uncomfortable to say, but I think that it's so common that it shouldn't, is that several years ago, I had been sexually assaulted, and you, Misha, were actually the first person that I told about it. And I wrote an essay, and one of the lines of the essay was that you have to choose your first listener carefully. And I know I did with you because, you know, I think the first time that you tell that story, you're putting yourself at such a risk. And however that person is going to react is going to probably define how you continue to tell your story after the fact. And one of the things that you did is that when we were hanging out with a group of people, his name had come up. And you didn't say anything, but you reached out and you held my hand. And that meant everything in the world to me, right? Just knowing that we were sort of privately in our own space sharing that pain, and you were letting me know that you were there for me. That is sort of the way that I think, you know, we're forced to operate in, but it was still one of the most meaningful things that ever happened to me.
Well, I'm glad that I was able to be there for you. And I think I see that in your stories again and again. I see the reflection of lived experiences, the ways in which women reach out to each other. And, you know, that sort of brings me to also the main story, or the titular story of this, because it does something similar. It's doing something interesting in threefold, like Strange Folk, for example. That's what the story is called. And I know the book is called Strange Folk You'll Never Meet. And I have to say this, like in a slant sort of way, I've met these people. I'm like, I know you, and I know you, I've heard about you, I've heard about you. And it's horrific to think that I had met these sorts of people in this sort of slant. But I want to say, like, first I want to know where the story comes from. Like, where did you find this story, in the world or within yourself? And but before you answer that, I want to say that there's the little girl who turns up, and then there is the woman at the laundrette, right? And they're all sort of reaching out to each other quietly. One of them is protecting the other. The one of them is trying to free her from the world. And again, I'm not providing any context right now. I'll let you do that. Part is because I'd like the audience to, you know, go find this book, which is a brilliant book and out on October 1st, and read it. So please tell me, where does the story come from? And what in you, you know, sort of, what did you have to excavate to write the story?
The story was inspired by, so there's this in England, and I'm probably going to tell this story a little wrong, but there was a true crime. They found this woman's body in a tree, sort of lodged into a tree, and she had, like, you know, taffeta in her mouth, like she had been murdered. And they didn't know who she was. But more famously from this, there was some graffiti that said, you know, who put Bella in the wych elm, and wych elm was the tree. And I think Bella was sort of the name that they had given her. And I was really struck by that. So I sort of decided to do a retelling of that, but in America, with the idea of a town that had crafted it itself and its economy around this sort of suffering, right? Because I think sometimes we do that. But I sort of didn't really want it to be necessarily about just like the horror of, you know, a murder that had taken place, but that within the town itself, these sort of daily horrors were happening.
Mhm.
And so the main character, who I named Bella because I'm not terribly creative.
Well, you clearly are, but perhaps you're rubbish with names.
I'm
That's all.
rubbish, so rubbish with
Right.
names. But she had a girl appears to her at the night. She's got two sons, and the two sons are coming in for the night, and a girl comes in with them, and she doesn't talk. She looks very strange, you know, she's barefoot, kind of dirty. And from there, you know, whenever I think a ghost shows up, the ghost is usually, you know, it represents something else, right?
Mm,
It's either a trauma from a past or
mm,
something that you're not, you know, you're hurting, but you're not acknowledging it. So it
mm.
sort of manifests in a way. Yeah.
I have to say this, it's sort of like, it's a haunting story. It's also thwack in the middle of the book.
It is.
And I wish I could like have you over to my class, and hopefully I will actually have you over to my class. And I would love to talk about the ways that we put together short story collections. Like, how do we actually go about curating a collection, where we put things? But this is not the time for that. What I would like to do is I'd like to read out a section of what traumatized me in the story.
Mhm.
Like, it is a story, I think, about female friendship and female bonds, and in the
Yeah.
ways that we can hold each other up and pull each other up. And sometimes um, we have to be brutal with each other for us to make sure that the other person survives. But
Mhm.
there's this great moment where it's just, I have to say this, I read this and then I kind of fell down on the floor down there for a
Are you
while, and then I had to unfurl my body out. So this is what it says. Her mother once told her a wandering mind will inevitably find a trail of sweets. But the more you eat, the more you follow. And eventually you'll find an oven at the end of it, and a witch with sick black teeth and one outstretched palm. I found myself completely traumatized with it, because it's telling us that we create our own hell in a way.
Yeah. And I agree. And I think the character in the story, Bella, she's dealing with her own things. There is a trauma which I won't give away.
Yeah.
But she sort of deals with it by focusing on not her relationship with her children, not her relationship with her. She does have a friend at the laundromat.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but she doesn't, that woman I think reaches out to her. I'm not sure
Mm-hmm.
how much Bella reaches out in that way too. But she's obsessed with not going into town, and so her greatest sort of fear is having to have to do the laundry, because that does take her into town.
Yeah.
And so she has this sort of like system in place, a ritual to make herself feel better, you
Yeah.
know, about like how long it takes to do the laundry.
Yeah. I
Hmm.
mean, and again, like, I think about the ways in which the story is constructed, like the idea that, Bella doesn't reach out, but somebody else reaches out to her.
Hmm.
But it is women reaching out to each other, like,
Yeah.
even when the response that you hope to get for your kindness is a little bit of, openness or warmth. But the truth is, kindness is its own reward, and one hopes that that is its own reward, and that, you're doing it because you see someone in pain and in need. But
Hmm.
to go back again to what, like, again, the thing that makes this collection so important for me is just the language, or like the turn in language. There's this great moment at the beginning of the story where you get this line: the stranger was a young thing, probably the age of the twins, but was the kind of girl who looked 1 minute older. It's this quirk. It's almost, I don't want to say quirky, because I sort of take away from the gravitas of this, but like, but was the kind of girl who looked 1 minute older. That's stunning.
Thank you.
Yeah. And like, where does the line come from? Tell me, where does that line come from? Like, in your brain, just let me sit in your brain is what I'm saying, basically.
Let me open up my soul and show you. I don't know. I have no idea.
I love that. I love that there is no definite answer. Like, sometimes the craft is the writing process is mysterious to us as well. Like, we're working on something and we don't know where the words came from. It just, and I don't mean it in the way that a muse is sitting on my shoulder and is like
Oh,
dictating
right.
to me, but I mean more in the sense that you're working on something, and a conjugation of words sounds just right, or expresses exactly what you're trying to say. But there's a wonderful oddity to it.
Yeah, and the one thing about being, you know, a writer, and I'm curious if you agree with me, is that we're constantly practicing our craft, right? Like even this conversation is us practicing our craft. When we read, it is, when we watch movies, when we sit and think. Because our tools are not like, you know, a paintbrush or, I don't know, a musical instrument, right? It's words, and we're constantly engaging with them. But I think what being a writer is that you pay so much attention to them, right? I mean, how often do you sort of like hear someone say something and you write it down because it's just the way that it's constructed is so interesting, right?
No, you're absolutely right. I feel like I'm constantly paying attention to craft. Like if I'm watching Netflix with my hand in my underwear for 4 hours, even if I'm just watching any kind of show, I'm so sorry. That's a vivid image. That's a really vivid image.
I hope that is what people take away from this interview.
I hope that is not what people take away from this interview. But even when I'm doing that, like at the back of my head, story is working constantly. I'm thinking frame by frame by frame, like how is story being put together? Like how is information being passed out? It's the same thing when I'm outside and I listen to someone say this, I have to often bite my tongue and say that would make a great story, because like I'm talking to an economist or a chemist or a Russian studies professor or like whoever, like I'm having a conversation with people who don't quite look at it. Like I'm constantly practicing it, or my brain is alive to it, is all the time alive to that possibility that, you know, that, you know,
it is sort of that openness, right? Like you're always open and you're always like searching, perhaps desperately, for like new and interesting ways of trying to explain what the world looks like through your lens.
No, I agree with you. And there's something practical about it. Like there's a practicality in the way that we're constantly mining every moment. And I think perhaps that's what makes us sensitive. I feel like I was just telling my students this today, that sometimes if someone says something to me as a throwaway comment and they're in a hurry, I will have a moment where I'm like, wait, what did that mean? Even if it's a throwaway comment, like my brother will say something to me and I'll be like, are you all right? Like, should we talk about this? And he's like, no, like, get away from me. Like, I'm fine. It was a throwaway comment. You know, the construction of all of those things matter. And actually, while we're on practicality, one of the other things I noticed in your stories, and so wonderfully so, especially in the first story, is how practical your heroines are. And it made me think about the new iteration of Little Women, where really the hero of the story is Amy, because women have had to be practical. The idea of choice, like whenever somebody tells me that, you know, women have so many choices, I always think, in what way? Like in what context, in what country, and in each country that choice diminishes or expands. And if anything, the last 8 years have taught us in this country is like how those choices can be taken away, or what's happening in Texas, right? So talk to me a little bit about Belle's practicality in that, and why is the practical heroine the heroine?
I think it is 100% because I am painfully practical. And I know that there's sort of that, like, you know, you are not what you write into your fiction. But for me, the logic of a story can only make sense if the logic makes sense to me. So the characters are practical because I am so painfully practical, like horribly painfully so.
Well, I love that's what, you know, I was expecting an answer where you were going to be like, you know, I think we need practical women and we need
absolutely
more of them in stories. Yes, so I'm glad that
we
that's
also
part
need
of it too.
Deeply unpractical women.
I agree. I think we need both sides, but I think perhaps like I read a lot of fiction, or that must be something wrong in the diet of fiction that I'm reading, where even my practical women that I come across are impractical in a way, like that our desires are impractical, even though the day-to-day is practical. And what I found interesting about Belle is that she's practical. Her desires are practical too. And then the other thing is like community, like for her, and this is the retelling of Beauty and the Beast, this beautiful retelling, and grotesque and just awesome. And there's something with eyes involved that everybody should read about. But she's also community oriented. Like I was at a birthday party 2 weeks ago, and I'm like at Hamilton College. So thank you, Hamilton, for having me for a year. And it was a birthday party, and there were a lot of intellectuals and artists all together. And there was conversation about, the kind of art that's being created or the research that you're doing. And I was talking to an economist who specifically focuses on altruism. And a test she does, her name is Wei, and Wei, I'm sorry if I get this wrong, but I'm hoping I'm getting this right. But she does this one particular test that tests sort of altruism in the way that she has people over in her lab, and then she offers them like maybe $10. And then she tells them that they are allowed to allocate to another person a certain amount of money from the $10 that they have. Now, once you allocate the money, say I allocate the money to you, you can tell me that I don't want that money. And if you say you don't want that money, neither of us gets that money. But if you say, I'll take what you've given me, then both of us benefit from the money. And so she tests to see like how much of their money will people allocate. And she finds that with women always tend to allocate more and share more. And this is the thing that I found interesting, is that in this fairy tale, you've got Belle, who's really practical, but she's practical in a community way. That, her love for the beast is not like, whatever she feels for the beast is not overshadowed by the hunger that she feels and that the community that she's a part of.
Yeah, I think I was mostly doing a real big middle finger to Disney on that one.
And also, if I'm not mistaken, at some point of time, you'd mentioned to me that you're also sort of like, it's an anti-love story, right? Like where we're not centering one person, you're centering a group of people.
But in that way, it's
the community becomes important.
Right, no, and maybe you could say that it's a love story for her community.
Yeah.
That you give up these sort of like individual desires for the collective good. And in fairness to her in that story, her community is starving. So, there are very pressing issues.
Agreed. Like love is like, just love is
thing fine, please eat first. Yes.
But please, I love that. We need that on a t-shirt. Love is fine, but please eat first.
Yes.
I feel like we should make that. We should get that t-shirt and then just put
so rich.
And like and put at the end like Kenyan review interview series. So that's where we got that from. So that would be amazing. So yeah, like thank you. I love that story. I love the practicality of that story. And going from that story, and there's so many of your stories that I'd like to talk about, but I can't help it. I couldn't help myself as someone who was raised in a family where Slavic literature meant a great deal, and whose father had once fancied himself a communist and was giving us Karl Marx and various things to read when we were young people. I was fascinated by the Mad Monk's Weeping Daughter. Because this is you are reimagining Rasputin's daughter's life. And the thing that I found just amazing was the ambition of the story, the historical ambition, the plotted ambition of the story, the excavation of emotion. There's so much ambition in the story. And I want to ask you, where did the story come from? Like, I wish I had like a smarter question to ask, but I'm like, where did the story come from? Again, please unfurl your brain so I can sit in it.
Very extremely unfortunately, most of my ideas come from watching television, also reading, but a lot of them, like, I see something on television and it sparks my interest. And I think there was at one point where my husband and I had watched the Romanovs, and then we had watched like a documentary about the early formation of, the communist revolution. And we kept doing this. And, of course, Rasputin's going to come up because he's the quirky figure in all of that. And so I went down a rabbit hole of just like, what was Rasputin up to, before he died? And then I found out that he had a daughter and I think actually several children, but and then I was like, what was she up to? When you have such a famous father who died in such a, pretty brutal way, like, what do you do after that? And it turns out she actually had a really fascinating life, like a surprisingly fascinating life. That story opens with a clipping from a newspaper.
That's right. And if I can read that, this is like, I loved that, we got a monograph at the beginning, right, of this. So she says, When I signed my contract to dance, Madame Maria Rasputin said to me in fluent French, I had no idea that I should have to dance to the tragedy of my father's life and death and be brought face to face on the stage with actors who were impersonating him and his murderers. Every time I have to confront my father on stage, a pang of poignant memory shoots through my heart, and I could break down and weep. And this is sort of like in the Advertiser, Adelaide, Tuesday, February 1929.
Yeah, and that really struck me. Like someone actually bothered to interview her about this, and there was sort of like a weird cruelty. Like she really laid out like how horrible the situation was for her, and that I think was absolutely what inspired me to think about, why would anyone want to witness that? Why would you want to witness someone reliving their trauma night after night after night? And so in my imagining, you know, they go to see her cry, right? Because like to see her suffering on stage, and the audience, you know, of course also begins to weep in this sort of like, you know, communal cathartic weeping party. And so eventually she starts, in my story, she starts to think about the power of her own tears. Like, are they magical? Are they actually moving the crowd? But yeah, the casual cruelty of that.
I know. I just think that the other thing that I was thinking about is there's the casual cruelty of that, but the ending of that story is her again. There's an agency to what she does, and I think that you've reimagined. Again, we've talked about like what does it mean to have agency in a cruel world, and I think this is a great example. The end of the story is a great example of that. Suddenly she has agency, she's made a different choice, but we know the consequences are going to be bad, and we don't need to know. That can happen off stage. Just for a moment there's a relief for her, and I thought that was beautiful. That was stunningly portrayed. There are so many stories in this collection that need to be read widely, that need to be taught. And I feel like The Mad Monk's Weeping Daughter is one of those stories.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, it could be an entire book. I'm just hint.
Oh, absolutely not. There was at one point where I was like Googling for that one, like when were folding chairs invented? Because historical fiction is really hard to write if you want to be like semi-accurate. I'm sure I messed it up, but semi-accurate.
I just thought it's so, this story sort of haunted me, the idea that she has to keep going back and like, and also it's set in Germany. So these German people are coming out to watch her, and their own misery is sort of reflected because they are sort of looking at her, allowing her to feel what they can't allow themselves to feel, perhaps. I thought that was just like stunning.
Thank you.
Like I said before, I could go through story by story by story and like really like take this apart, but I'm going to stop just because I want to make sure that, you know, that we don't run out of time. One, the practicality. I'm like taking a leaf out of your book. But the other thing too is like, I'd like to leave some surprises up to our readers, you know, when they get the book in their hand. But before I sort of like go off, before I let you go, actually, I wanted to talk about, because we talked about the ambition of that story. Like for me, I think one of the most satisfying things is that you made a reach, this ambitious reach for a story, and you realize it and you fulfill it in this stunning sort of way. And I guess like, I am curious about what your opinion of ambition is as a writer, as an artist, and yeah, I guess like as an artist and a writer, what is your opinion about ambition and the ambitions that we ascribe to ourselves and the ambitions that the world ascribes to us?
I don't put a whole lot of faith, I guess, in ambition. I honestly find it fairly ambitious that people get out of bed in the morning. That seems real ambitious.
Especially now, right? Like considering the world that we've been living in for more than a year, and it feels like it's getting better, but then it isn't. And
no, I know ambition is usually sort of like taught to us from that sort of capitalist approach that, you know, you have to have an extremely well-paying job and prestige, and even in the publishing world, you know, you go after these prizes, and, you know, even having a book at all, I suppose, is ambitious. But I don't know. It's like of course, you know, I would like all of those things. It would be nice to, you know, have fancy prizes or grants or fellowships or residencies and all of that. But if I don't get them, that's fine. I'm honestly very like humbled and surprised whenever anyone publishes my work. I'm always like, that is fantastic. So I guess the lesson there is if you keep your expectations like super, super low, you will only be happy.
I'm not sure what to say to that, because I'm such a fan of your work, and I think that it deserves more attention, and it is getting more attention. And I always think that it's always the third and the fourth book of a writer that really cracks their talent open in this sort of interesting way. Like even Lauren Groff, I think about Fates and Furies, and now she's got this new beautiful book out, which is like stunning. So I can't wait to see what comes up next. And I know that currently, at least, your ambition has turned to your next project. And would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I have been trying and failing to finish this bloody novel.
Oh my God, novels. It's all like you just fail and fail and fail until you finish it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. No, I'm trying to write a novel. So that is the current project. If it ever finishes, that would be great. So great.
First, I want to say that it's ambitious to conceive of a novel. It's ambitious to sit down and write that novel. So the ambition is there. And I'm pretty sure that you will finish that novel, and I can't wait to get my hands on it. And, you know, I'll just say that if it's anything like your short story collections, I know it's going to devastate me and at the same time give me hope. And I know that even though your work is brutal, there is a gentle kindness in there. And it's there for the reader to find it if they're paying attention to it. So I look forward to that gentle kindness.
Well, we'll hope. I've been going through a major revision of it, and there's been moments where even I was like, oh, that was too dark.
I mean, I'm glad that you are having that moment, because I'm really looking forward to that manuscript and being able to find hope. I think one of the most radical things that we can do right now is acknowledge what the world is, and then still look within that acknowledgement for moments of hope and knit the world together with that. Well, on that note, I just want to say thank you so very much for letting me do this interview, for letting the Kenyan Review have you. We're so glad that you are our third guest on the Kenyan Review interview series.
Thank you so much to both you and to Kenyan. This was wonderful.
Yeah, and to everyone out there, please go and buy Strange Folk You'll Never Meet. It is just a gorgeous collection.
Thank you.